Happy 2025, everyone. For our first Reminiscing video for the year, we are taking a look at Ninja Theory's breakout cinematic epic, Heavenly Sword, which is a PlayStation 3 exclusive that was actually a pretty notable release for me, as it was one of the first games I played for the system, and remember it being pretty heavily advertised prior to the game's launch. While not Ninja Theory's first game, I think many would probably consider this release to be the start of the studio really finding its identity and creating cinematic experiences that took place in very interesting and creative worlds with characters that just come alive off screen through excellent performances. Now, Heavenly Sword is a hack and slasher that takes place in this fictional fantasy setting where there's this ancient weapon called the Heavenly Sword that has been protected for generations by this particular village. The entire game to me almost feels like a creative spin on Greek mythology, and you have these eccentric characters who sort of see themselves as gods. And there's, of course, the sword itself, which gives you these unnatural abilities. There's different mutations and enemies that you fight along the way as well. And I think when you mash everything up, you get an experience that is definitely unique and offers an interesting look at cinematic storytelling, especially considering that this is a first-year launched title for a brand new generation and system. Now, Ninja Theory employed some pretty notable talent here. Andy Serkis actually voice acts and does the motion capture for the main villain in the game. And his performance is just as captivating as his others. The way he plays this guy as this sort of interesting balance between absolute insanity and complete obsession with the sword itself, it's just fantastic. Every single time you see him on screen, you just can't help but pay attention to every word that he's saying, and the facial animations in particular just help bring the nuance to his performance. He's fantastic. But I also must give credit to Noriko's actress, the main character, Anna Torv, who some of you may also recognize from the Last of Us TV series. She played Tess in that adaptation. Overall, the presentation here is really top-notch. I'll get into the graphics and audio later in the video, but let's kick off as we always do with breaking down the various different elements, of course starting with the signature gameplay. On the whole, Heavenly Sword is a hack and slash game that controls very similarly to the original God of War games, with a few key twists to give it its own identity. Now, as I mentioned before, the Heavenly Sword is your main weapon of choice here, and after being cornered and at the risk of the sword being stolen, Noriko ends up using the blade, and the story goes that once you touch the sword, you are destined to use it until death. The sword itself quite literally sucks the life out of you as you use it. So with her back against the wall, Noriko has to use the sword as sort of one final stand. And she has only days until she perishes, and she has to use every opportunity she has to defeat the evil regime of the Bogan Empire, which is the main villains here. Now, what makes this game stand out a bit more is the sort of shape-shifting behavior of the sword itself. The sword can split into two separate weapons. It can even shorten further, and you can use it like the Blades of Chaos, swinging it around in chains. And you can even join the two pieces together to create this oversized blade, which helps you take out much larger and stronger foes. All of these different modes that the weapon has itself are useful in different situations, and you just seemingly switch between these modes using the L1 and R1 buttons on your controller. And there are certain combos in the game. I found the experience to be very simple enough to the point where you can pretty much mostly mash your way through the entire game with little to no issue. The rest of the gameplay is a mix-up of quick-time event sequences. This was the mid-2000s, but here I actually think they work a bit better than other games. And there's also some light exploration, but this game has a fixed camera angle most of the time. So you'll be walking through these environments, and there may be some health packs or vases that you can sort of break along the way to get you some more energy. Speaking on energy, the more enemies you dispatch and the more combos you rack up, you actually fill this meter that's in the top left of this screen here, and you can use this to do special moves which change depending on specific modes that the Heavenly Sword is currently in. There's area of effect attacks, there's super quick combos and instant kill animations. They all sort of come into play here, and I really like it. It's a fun time. There's even some light motion handling where, if you get hit or knocked back, you can actually shake the 6-axis controller and have Noriko sort of latch back onto the enemy to recover quickly. I should also mention that you don't just play as her throughout the entire game. You actually switch to a different character, Kai, and she's sort of this kind of young, quirky type of heroine, but she's really good at long range weaponry. And so during these stages of the game, you sort of play it like a third person shooter. And if you can believe it, you sort of fire these crossbow bolts at enemies, and you can even control the direction and speed of these bolts itself using the motion controller. And of course, you guys know what time it is. Let's take a look at the Heavenly Sword box art for PlayStation 3. I really like the cover art for this one. Narika with her hair kind of swaying in the background. There's, the signature red hair and stuff looks really cool. And as we turn it over to the back here, it gives you kind of a cool synopsis on the story and the world and all that stuff. A couple of different screenshots. It talks about Andy Serkis and, Hollywood motion capture and all the stuff that they were building. So that's pretty neat. Inside, we have a pretty clean game disc here, again, with Narika's hair kind of blowing over the Heavenly Sword there. So that's pretty cool. And we even have some back cover art for this one, which we'll take a look at in a bit. Now, the manual for this game is just gorgeous. They did a great job with this manual. It's in full color. It has a decent number of pages here and just goes into great detail about the story, the controls, the game screen, all the different options, and the Heavenly Sword itself, different modes within those styles and things like that. It's just a really well put together manual. And we even have some ads here at the end. So we have an ad for MotorStorm, which I checked out already, and then the Uncharted Drake's Fortune, the first game, which I'll be reviewing later on in the future. All right, and a cool ad for Lara on the back. And as we take a look at the back cover art here, again, this is kind of unique for a lot of PS3 games. You got this gorgeous cover art. I used this for the thumbnail in the video as well. It just looks fantastic. So anyway, yeah, cool look at the Heavenly Sword box art for PlayStation 3, and I like the cover art for this one. Now, being one of the premier PlayStation 3 exclusives, needless to say, Heavenly Sword is quite beautiful. I think even today it stands strong due to very good artistic direction. And while you can certainly pick apart, different elements with the game's visuals, having this game come out only a few weeks after Sony's botched release of Lair, this was a much better showing for the platform and just gaming in general. All of the cool cinematic effects are in use here, and this game has a very bright and colorful setting as well, which I think helps stand it apart from many of the gray, desaturated worlds that many criticize games from this era to have. But I think it looks great overall. The character models here are also some of the best I've seen so far, at least from this initial launch slew of games. And I think when you consider all the releases, both first and third party games up to this launch, it probably did have one of the best looking character models and worlds out of gaming. And you just have this incredible sense of scale with the game, right? It's very linear, but you just sort of have these really interesting backgrounds to look at. And the details of the buildings in the distance, the landscapes all around you, they're quite nice. Now, you also have these huge epic battle sequences, and this is really where the game flexes its muscles, because it seamlessly renders hundreds of people around you at any given point. And towards the end of the game, you'll just be in awe as enemy combatants sort of surround you as you're battling for your life. It's just incredibly impressive. So visually, the game looks great. I think it definitely hit on the expectations that Sony was putting out there for the PlayStation 3. So I think when you look at this game combined with, games like MotorStorm coming out in the same year, as well as Uncharted Drake's Fortune, it all really possessed a great visual experience that, felt perhaps not leaps and bounds better than the competition, but definitely improved. And I'll touch on frame rate stability here very quick. There's really nothing to say. I think the frame rate is kept very solid throughout the experience. I didn't really encounter any big hitches when I was playing. Perhaps when there's a bunch of enemies on screen, it starts to dip there, but it's nothing that's going to take you out of your experience or completely ruin the gameplay. The 30 FPS lock in this game held firm perceptibly, most of the time at least. And as we touch on the audio for Heavenly Sword, this equally deserves merit. The music is just fantastic. It's not quite as noteworthy as some other releases around this time, but I quite dig it. There's just this nice range and bass added to the mix. and the sword itself makes different sounds depending on the object it's being grinded against or the mode it's in. You can sort of hear the chains whistling as you're throwing the swords around. And again, worth keeping in mind as we go over the technical specs here, Ninja Theory was gunning for a level of cinematic achievements that put games more in line with that of creative films. And I think when you look at everything in motion, they definitely achieved that and did it better than most from this era, I would say. So, in conclusion, Heavenly Sword is a very fun hack and slasher with an interesting set of characters, an interesting world. I think if I had to levy any criticism against it, I think that the only thing I could possibly say is that the game is quite short. You can actually beat it in close to one sitting, definitely over a weekend. But honestly, these days, I would much rather have an experience that takes, 6 hours but is enjoyable through and through than an experience that takes 60 hours and is just mediocre at best. Now, before I go here, I also wanted to share a quick short story. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that the game was a pretty notable release for me, and it was actually the second game I ever played on the PS3. I spoke a bit about this in my MotorStorm video, but Sony had these large semi-trucks parked outside of retail stores shortly after the PlayStation 3 was launched, and outside my local Best Buy, they had one of these trucks available. And so MotorStorm, which was the first game I ever played on PS3, I got to play with that experience, but it was also Heavenly Sword. There were two games there I got to play on the system, and I wanted both of these games so bad growing up, man. I would just remember getting the console later that year for Christmas, and I think it wasn't around until around like early 2008 or so when I finally got to try this game out for the first time. But yeah, when I think of this game and in MotorStorm, the memory just comes flooding back to me. And, wanted to share that here. The point of this video as well is to sort of take a look back and, look at these games and the impact that they had back then. So, yeah, that was sort of my first experience with Heavenly Sword. And playing it all these years later, it just reminded me of just how special that experience was for me. So let me know if you guys played this one. Ninja Theory is still going strong to this day. I know not many were enthralled with Hellblade 2, Senua's Saga. I have yet to play that game, but I really love the first Hellblade. And of course, after this game, they would go on to make Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, which I'll undoubtedly do a video on in the future. I actually think I did a full review on Enslaved back when the game came out on the channel. But anyway, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.